When I first came to Frankfort and became acquainted with the Frankfort Cemetery, people were telling me that this was the second cemetery of its type in the United States, that it was patterned after the one at Mount Auburn in Greater Boston, Massachusetts. At first I had some trouble figuring out what type it was. And then I did a little more investigation, and I found out that the thing that Frankfort Cemetery had in common with Mount Auburn was that they were the first efforts at the rural cemetery movement, that they had a horticultural base, and that they were operated by an independent corporation. Up until beginning the 1800s, about the only cemeteries in northern states were church cemeteries, and they were getting crowded. They were generally small and in the cities and hemmed in, and they were getting crowded. Now in Virginia and possibly some of the other middle colonies, the law required that every plantation have its own cemetery, and so there are a lot of those old ones left. They were having trouble particularly in Boston because the cemeteries they had there were filled up. They were burying people in the basement of churches. They were digging up some remains to bury others, and there was concern about the health problems. So there began to be an interest in Boston in establishing a new type of cemetery. One of the persons who was interested in it was Dr. Jacob Bigelow, who was a young physician, teacher at Harvard, and was secretary of the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. And his friend, General Henry A.S. Dearborn, was president of that society. So in planning a cemetery of the type they had in mind, they worked with the Horticultural Society. In 1825, Jacob Bigelow invited about a dozen prominent Bostonians to discuss the prospect. Among those were Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story and Edward Everett. In 1830, George Bremer offered 72 acres on the Cambridge-Watertown line known as Mount Auburn for a cemetery. So the Horticultural Society set up the cemetery. Bigelow was the leader in organizing the cemetery. He was a scholar of Greek literature and also a student of Egyptian history. What they were seeking was a place where the living and the dead commune through nature. So they established the cemetery with great fanfare. It ran for a few years that way, and then they found that the goals of the cemetery and of the Horticultural Society didn't work too well together, so the cemetery company took it over completely. Our number 5 son, Larry, lives in Cambridge, about 6 or 8 blocks from Mount Auburn Cemetery. So we were up there and we decided to see what about Mount Auburn, since it was so frequently mentioned in connection with the Frankfort Cemetery. Here are some of the scenes we found there. Guess I better turn the light on. Here's the entrance, and you can see the Egyptian influence there, a result of Bigelow's interest. here's a general scene in the cemetery. You see the large number of trees, and it looks very much like most cemeteries around here, of the type that were planned this way. There's a family group, and you see instead of fences, they have a row of flowers around it to mark it off. That's a view of the where the lake was, and they planted that and graded it. And there's another view of that, and you see a vault in a hill behind the lake. And there is a significant tree, but I disremember what the significance of it is, but that's Eileen standing there by it, and it was there's something famous about that tree. It's one of the maybe original trees that was in it when the cemetery was started. All the streets are named for trees, and then they have footpaths that are named for flowers. And so you can locate a grave that it's on Periwinkle Path, not far from Magnolia Street. That is the monument to Robert Gould Shaw, a young Bostonian who was the commander of the Black Regiment that was featured in the movie Glory. Any of you see that? Well, that's the grave of the commander. That he was killed in an attack on Fort Warren in South Carolina, leading his Black Regiment. Dorothea L. Dix was a famous woman activist in the 19th century. She did a lot to encourage hospitals for the mentally ill, and also to improve prison conditions. Apparently the people who put that up thought that that was all they needed, to just give her name. Very simple monument. That is the monument of Edward Everett, and he was the man who spoke for 2 hours before Lincoln at Gettysburg. We'll come back to him again. That's painter Winslow Homer. You've probably seen his painting. And this, I guess, is the most spectacular monument. That's Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science. There's a close-up of her monument. There is one of the more ornate monuments in the cemetery, and I've seen pictures of that. There are some very beautiful flowers in front there, and it makes a nice picture when they are blooming. In contrast, here's one that's very simple, severe, yet makes a statement, quite a contrast to the one before. There's one that was unusual, an Episcopal preacher, and you see it's sort of a stone above ground casket. That is the monument for Chickering, the piano man. And there's a sheltered vault. There are several of those. There's a more modernistic monument. There's apparently a 2-story vault. That's the first I ever saw like that. There's a Celtic or Celtic cross, which I think we have 1 or 2 of those in Frankfort Cemetery. Of course, that's an Irish emblem. And some of you, of course, have seen the dog in the Frankfort Cemetery. Well, Mount Auburn has its dog too. And here's the story. That's the grave of William Frederick Herndon. He founded the first express delivery company. but such fierce competition developed that he died bankrupt at the age of 33. I guess he was the counterpart of UPS. And perhaps it was guilt on the part of his creditors that caused the express companies to erect this statue in 1866. A marble mastiff guards an urn standing on a large square base, supposed to be a safe. On opposite faces of the safe are two female figures, one delivering and one receiving a package from an expressman. This hillside vault is of the Lowell family, and we'll have some reference to that in Frankfort. Now, this was supposed to come before that. This is the Cushman family, and while you can't see it in the picture, they had something there that I don't remember having seen before. The stones read, Wayman Crow Cushman, solicitude. Emma Crow Cushman, discernment. Edwin Charles Cushman, reflection. Apparently these are words to describe the people. And then one is Sally Mercer, devotion. A lifelong faithful servant and friend of Charlotte Cushman. I've never seen that before. And this is Oliver Wendell Holmes. And they have a Washington monument in the cemetery on the highest point. And it seemed to me like it's 212 or 290 steps up to it. No elevator. And you walk up there, but this is some of the view you get. Our son Larry's house is back in there someplace between that tall building in the center and the reddish buildings on the left. He's back there someplace. Now I want to back up some. I'm going to head my pencil. And this is the last one I was going to show on Mount Auburn. This is the Union Victory Monument. Remember I told you that Bigelow was a scholar of Egyptian history and architecture. So you see that's a copy of the Sphinx. And the inscription says, American Union preserved, African slavery destroyed, by uprising of a great people, by the blood of fallen heroes. Mount Auburn was widely admired and imitated, first in the East and then in the Midwest. It became one of the principal cultural institutions of the 19th century. And the first one that we know of to follow that plan was the Frankfort Cemetery in 1844. The Lexington Cemetery and Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville, which are much the same pattern, were 1848. And Paris and Winchester and a number of other towns followed suit. In 1859, Rose Hill in Chicago, designed by Scotch horticulturalist William Saunders. You see, it's moving west. Now let's jump forward to 1860. In Chicago, in 1859, Rose Hill in Chicago, designed by William Saunders. And in 1860, a similar one in Springfield, where President Lincoln was living. Lincoln and his wife very likely were at the dedication of that cemetery, and when Lincoln was killed, Mary Todd insisted that Lincoln should be buried in the Springfield Cemetery. Then came the Civil War. In 1863, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, the Battle of Gettysburg. When the battle was over, there were about 8,000 dead men scattered along Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge and Emmitsburg Road, and some in Gettysburg. Lee's army was in bad shape, and he hastened to get back to Virginia, and Meade started out after. They didn't have time to bury their dead. So Gettysburg was left with 8,000 men and thousands of horses rotting in July sun. Governor William Curtin of Pennsylvania was in an election, hard-fought election for re-election, and he thought that was not a very nice situation to have in his state. So he appointed Judge David Wills, and now I didn't arrange this to get all the Wills in, but this is just coincidence. Judge David Wills was a local leader, politician, and community activist. Governor Curtin asked David Wills to do something about that. So David secured the land for the cemetery. There was already a cemetery there, but of course they needed much more land, and so he secured that, and secured William Saunders to lay it out so that all the states could be represented, and no distinction of rank of the fallen man, and of course no Confederates to be buried there. And they wanted to have some kind of a big ceremony to set off the cemetery. So David Wills invited, first he asked William Cullen Bryant and Longfellow and Whittier to write some poetry to suit the occasion, but for their own reasons they declined. So David Wills decided to invite the premier speaker of that time, Edward Everett, which you remember you saw his tomb in Mount Auburn. And Edward Everett had been active in organizing Mount Auburn. So David Wills made arrangements for him to come out and make the big speech. Then, sort of as an afterthought, he suggested that maybe President Lincoln would want to come and say a few appropriate words. And that's what happened. Edward Everett spoke for 2 hours and recounted the history of cemeteries and the burial of heroes, recounted all the battles of the Civil War up to that time, but came to the point of expressing the idea of a cemetery that would enable to be a lesson for the living as well as a place for burial of the dead. And it was not till I read Gary Wills, coincidence, another Wills, he's too smart to be kin to me, I think, wrote a book about Lincoln at Gettysburg. And it wasn't until I read that book, and he describes Mount Auburn and the connection, Edward Everett, and then I saw the true connection between Mount Auburn and Frankfort. It was Edward Everett who tied the two together as the movement had spread from Mount Auburn through Frankfort to the west and then back to Gettysburg. Now back to Frankfort. In the 1830s and 40s, most burials in Frankfort had been either in some church cemeteries around town or up on the hill in a place that seems to have been called Bellevue. And that property up there apparently belonged to Ambrose Dudley. And in 1844, he put a notice in the paper that there couldn't be any more burials there because they were running out of space. And so some of the leading men in Frankfort, just as they had done in Boston, decided to plan a cemetery. And one of the leaders was Mason Brown. And he had been to Mount Auburn, had seen Mount Auburn. Brown went to college at Yale, and he had kinfolks in New England. And so apparently when he was up there visiting some of them, they took him to see Mount Auburn, and he was much impressed with it. And so when they started organizing the cemetery in Frankfort, he insisted that they should follow the pattern of Mount Auburn, a place laid out with plants and flowers and trees to make it a beautiful place for the living to commune with the dead. The cemetery was incorporated in 1844, and the first burial in it was Daniel Boone, who was brought back from Missouri, supposedly. Of course, you know there's a controversy about whether they really got Daniel Boone's bones or not, but it makes no difference. There's something up there that represents him, and that's fine. They had a great to-do about reburying Daniel Boone. It was probably the biggest celebration there ever was in Frankfort, or certainly up to that time. And Jim Richardson thinks that maybe that was planned by the cemetery board to give their new cemetery a good send-off. And they hired Robert Carmichael, another Scotch landscape gardener, to choose the site and plan Frankfort Cemetery. And Carmichael was the one who suggested Robert E. Lonitz to do the war memorial ordered by the state a few years later. The first burial after Daniel Boone was Lucian Wingate, who was buried 4th January 1846. He was the son of a board member of this cemetery. The first woman buried was Elizabeth Love on 19th of January 1846. Very likely she was the outstanding woman in the early years of Frankfort. Now let's look at some of the representative scenes from Frankfort. Now that's the entrance to Frankfort Cemetery. You're all familiar with. Some of the trees in bloom at the proper season. More of the trees blooming. The monument to Ambrose Dudley, the man who had had the other cemetery, and who was a big man about Frankfort in those days. Peter Dudley, who was kin to Ambrose, I've forgotten what. And Peter Dudley lived on a house that's about where the chapel in the cemetery is now. And he had owned some of that land. So that's Peter Dudley and his wife. And there, of course, is Daniel Boone, the #1 attraction in the cemetery. And you know who that is? That's one of Daniel's favorite companions, Ellison Williams. Now, if you can read it, you see his stone says Williamson. And after considerable research, I'm convinced that his name really was Williams and not Williamson. I believe that's the only place it shows as Williamson. And you can see by the stone he has and the surroundings, it's kind of back behind Daniel Boone's stone, that he didn't get comparable building to Daniel. He was one of the pallbearers when Daniel Boone was buried there, and he died a few years later. That's Lucian Wingate, the first man buried in the cemetery. He, of course, was kin to the Paul Sawyer. And that's Elizabeth Love, the first woman buried. And she operated the Love Tavern, which is where, well, across the street from Orlando Brown House. And she and Margaretta Brown started the first Sunday school west of the Allegheny Mountains. And she was a very active woman at the time. The most, I guess, heroic monument there is that of William Goebel. And of course, you know this old story. The statue of Goebel down in front of the old Capitol is a rather benign statue with his arms folded and contemplating. And this one, he got his hand up as if he's making a rip-roaring speech. The two statues were ordered at the same time, and some think they got them wrong, that this was the one intended to be downtown and that the other one was the one intended to be in the cemetery. I don't know, but there they are, so that's what we have. Here's another great Kentuckian, John J. Crittenden, the monument on the left there. And you see that what looks like a cloth draped over the monument. I'm certain that that represents the mort cloth, which in England and Scotland probably, maybe more so than this country, but that was a cloth that was put on the casket on the way to burial. The rich people had their own gold embroidered with gold and so forth. Poor people couldn't afford that, and so the church would have a mort cloth that they would rent to people when they died. So if you have an ancestor, kinsman, whose date you aren't certain about, if you can find the church record when they rented the mort cloth for him, that'll give you just about the time that he died. There are a few of those mort cloth monuments around. John J. Crittenden was probably the greatest Kentuckian next to Henry Clay, and some think that he was a greater man than Henry Clay. Sorry about that. That is the monument to two governors. The legislature ordered the keeper of the penitentiary to build a monument for Governor, well, I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name, but a monument for one governor and a monument for another governor. I believe the superintendent sort of cut short because he built one monument and put one man on one side and one on the other. So that's a monument to two of our early governors. There's another governor, and you can see the difference in the scale of these monuments. That's Governor Moorhead and his wife, I believe. Rather humble little monument for a governor. And that's another governor, he's a Republican governor, I think. Who is he, Eileen?
I don't know. Bradley?
Yes, I believe he is. I believe that's William O. Bradley. Yeah. Yeah, yes, that's Bland Ballard, the famous Indian fighter, and his wife. He was buried, I believe, over in Shelby County and was brought here for burial. One of the great Indian fighters of Kentucky. And that is Presley N. O'Bannon, the man who put the shores of Tripoli in the Marine song. He had been visiting just a few days before he died in the house in which I was born. He had kinfolks there. And then he moved over to some other kinfolks about 2 miles across the field and died there, and was buried there. And then in the patriotism following World War I, they had his remains, such as they could find, dug up and brought here, buried with considerable fanfare there too. That's on the edge of the War Memorial Mound. There's the monument for O'Bannon, and I think, I haven't been able to find out for certain, I think that was probably the one that was put up out on the farm when he was buried out there. And that, of course, is the War Memorial, done by Robert E. Lonitz. That's the monument to Richard M. Johnson, Vice President from Kentucky. I guess the only one other than Alvin Barkley. He is famous for a law to end imprisonment for slavery and for the Sunday Mail report. It seems that back in those days when he was in the Senate, there was a big argument on whether they ought to move the mail on Sunday or not. And he issued a report on it. And he probably might have been, he was vice president, and he might have been president if it hadn't been that he had 2 mulatto daughters that people were critical about. He lived over at Stamping Ground. That's the monument for Theodore O'Hara, who wrote the poem The Last Bivouac. Bivouac of the Dead. Sorry, glad some of y'all got a better memory than I have. The Bivouac of the Dead, which is really an excellent poem, and that's it. This is B. Nicholas Smith. B. Nicholas Smith was from Frankfort. He went to New York and worked on Horace Greeley's paper, married Horace Greeley's daughter, and had a professional career in New York journalism. And he was judged, I don't know who the judges were, but he was judged at the time to be the handsomest man in America. So there you have it. And that's another monument by Lonitz. And you see that has something like a mort cloth on it too. Not as obvious as the other. That's Judge Elliott, who was Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals in about 1870. And he was assassinated by a fellow who felt aggrieved by a decision in the court on a land deal. And he was so incensed by it and felt that he'd been treated unjustly that he came to Frankfort and shot Judge Elliott, killed him instantly. If you ever go up in the cemetery, you ought to go there and look at the inscription on that. It's about the most laudatory description I've ever seen of someone. Judge Elliott had been in the Confederate Congress and been a judge in eastern Kentucky, and then came to Frankfort to serve on the Court of Appeal. that, of course, is Paul Sawyer's monument, close to the Lucian Wingate we showed you earlier. That is a monument to Leonard, the first man who learned how to take telegraph messages by sound rather than the perforated paper which they'd used up to that time. He was a very young man, and he devised this and served in the Civil War. I believe died during the war. If you look closely on the upright shaft, on each corner is a telegraph pole. And then on the front of the monument you see the hand and the telegraph key. And there's some a very interesting inscription on that monument too. Now this section is what I'm calling callings. You see, Leonard was a telegrapher. Here is a photographer. Some of you may have pictures by Cusick. I think these monuments were provided by Bill Rogers, part of his attempt to recognize photographers. And there's another photographer. Maybe none of you are old enough to remember them. Now this is in the Callings. This is a monument of James C. Brown, who was a black stonemason. And so you see he made his own monument. A very nice monument. That's Joel T. Hart, the famous sculptor. This is in the state lot, on the state lot. And here's the one that we found very interesting when we were working on the book. And let me stop here a minute and do something I should have done in the start. There wouldn't any of this be here if it weren't for Ramona Slattery. Ramona, where are you? Ramona was the one who worked about 12 years and worked hard to create the Frankfort Cemetery book. And she deserves a great deal of credit for that. And did you bring some books with you tonight? Well, she has some books, and if you want to buy one, I bet she would autograph it for you right here tonight.
I worked a lot on this, but I still didn't learn as much about it as you.
Oh. Well, that book has about 15,000 burials recorded in it, the names and dates and so forth. And it's a right good book, if I do say so myself. But in working that, we found this monument, Hugh Rodman Level. He was a Frankfort man who had a distinguished career as a doctor, particularly in public health work. And you see there's some writing on the front of it there that we couldn't read at all, and we're puzzled by it. So I took a picture of that and sent it to our son in Cambridge, who teaches at Harvard Divinity School, and he passed it around some of his language students, and some of them decided that it looked like it was Dear Doctor in Hindi. And then after all of that, we looked back just right behind him, his father, Hugh Nelson Level, the beloved physician. So on Hugh Rodman's, see that's Hindi for beloved physician, taken from Luke, isn't it? And presumably the reason for that, Level, he was health doctor in Louisville in the public health service, I mean the Jefferson County Health Department. And then he went to India after the war to help set up the public health system in India. And that undoubtedly is why they put the beloved physician in Hindi on his. He was cremated not body there. John W. Cannon was the owner and pilot of the Robert E. Lee steamboat. And you remember that he won the famous race between the Natchez and the Robert E. Lee. And so the contemporary accounts said that he was the most popular man in America after that. It was, you know, comparable to Lindbergh in our time. So now we had the most handsomest man in America, and now we have the most popular man in America buried in our cemetery.
Was he the one in the race? I mean, at Paddock?
Again, in the callings, this is Nickel, the first man to operate a garage in Frankfort. And they designated that on his tombstone. Some of you may. Bruce, you don't remember him, do you? No, sir. Well. And this is the.
Yes.
Mayor, do you remember?
Yes, very well.
Oh, all right. This is the Swigert family. And you remember Philip and Jacob Mayer? You remember some of the various things that Philip did?
Philip was the first mayor of Frankfort in 1850.
Well, he was just a man for everything. I mean, he was big in lodges, business, railroads, and just a lot of different organizations. At the time, he must have been the most active leader in Frankfort. And that reddish stone is the family marker, and then these others are the various members of the family. Notice they're all similar. That was Philip, wasn't it? Swigert. S-W-I-G-E-R-T. Swigert. And he had a brother who was not quite so active.
Jacob.
Yeah, Jacob Swigert. Mayor, maybe you can help me out on some of these if you can. Speak up. But.
I didn't know Daniel Boone personally. No.
Well, you're not like fellow over Winchester, old fellow, knew a lot of stuff, and somebody asked him, said, well, I bet as old as you are, you knew Daniel Boone. He said, no, I didn't know Daniel, but I knew his grandfather well. Now here is Frankfort's dog monument, and that's on the Raglan lot. And I understand that the young man, the Raglan family, went away to war and never returned. And he had a dog, and the dog, after he was gone, the dog pined away and died for loneliness of his master. And so his family put this statue of the dog on their lot. So you see Mount Auburn had their dog, and Frankfort has its dog. There's Vivian C. Moore, many of you remember, a teacher, genealogist, all around fine person. Anything more we should say about her, Ramona?
Well, I was just thinking she'd be so proud to see that there.
All the men in Frankfort were when they went to war.
Yeah. Now here's another one, Bruce. Lucy Fenton Patty. She was working at Kentucky Military Institute when it was located where the Stewart Home is now. You know, the main building there at Stewart Home was the Kentucky Military Institute building. And Lucy was working out there when the Civil War began. And all of the cadets were going off to join the Army. And they had a Sigma Alpha Epsilon chapter there. And they wanted to someone to take care of their records. But there was not going to be anybody left, and it had to be a member of the fraternity. So they initiated Lucy Fenton Patty into Sigma Alpha Epsilon fraternity, and she kept her records during the war. I don't know whether there ever been another woman in SAE or not, but certainly she was.
Isn't she the one that the guy who came to get the records had to give her the secret handshake before she turned them over?
Probably so. That sounds typical. You know, the marker beside of it is to someone who was killed in the war. Now this is Roaring Jack Russell, isn't it, Eileen? Roaring Jack was one of the famous characters in early Frankfort. I doubt if there's been any other to equal him. Roaring Jack ran a steamboat, well, various steamboats, and he was in the New Orleans trade. He was going down the river one time, and a man got on who was a preacher, and he was going down south to buy some land, maybe in Mississippi, and he had a roll of money with him. They stopped at Natchez under the Hill, and you know at that time Natchez under the Hill was the den of iniquity of the Mississippi Valley, if not the whole continent. A lot of gamblers, thieves, rogues, various kinds hung out there. So the man went in the store to make a purchase, the minister that is, and he used the ill judgment to pull out his wad of money to get a bill to pay for something. And some of the rogues were in there and saw him. When he went out, they waylaid him and stole all his money. The man went down to the boat and told Roaring Jack what had happened. And of course, Roaring Jack didn't want that to go unpunished because it would give his boat a bad name, and besides, it just wasn't fair. So he went up, found these men who had taken refuge in a small house along the riverbank. And Roaring Jack tried to get them to come out and give the man his money back, and they wouldn't do it. So he sent his crew down to get a cable from the boat, brought it up on the bank, and tied around this little house, and gave his pilot full speed astern. And no sooner had the house started moving down the river that the fellows came out and gave the minister's money back. He was in various other escapades, a fist fight with Lafitte the pirate, I think, and various other things. But the strange thing is, with all of that, he was a solid citizen. He was a director of the bank. I don't know whether it was the predecessor of the Farmers Bank or not. Bruce, do you know? Anyway, he was a very solid citizen in Frankfort and one of the directors of the bank. Now, back behind that, you see the Saffel Monument, one of the superintendents of the cemetery, and I hadn't been able to figure out the significance of that. Urban V.W. Darlington. Some of you may remember when he was bishop in the Methodist Church. He was from Grafenberg, and I always wondered how he got the rather odd name Urban Valentine Williams Darlington. He had gone to Kentucky Wesleyan College with a man who was my pastor and good friend, and I always wondered how he got that name. He generally went by UVW Darlington. And then I found that there was Urban Valentine Williams was a doctor in Frankfort, a very active citizen, was head of the county schools and then the city schools, and was active in the Commerce Club. In fact, in the Commerce Club, he was chairman of the Committee on Reform and Retrenchment. Now, what a Commerce Club does about retrenchment, I don't know, but that was his position in the club. This is the grave of the Ganoes and another famous Baptist minister. They, of course, were not buried here originally. They were buried out in the county. and then were later brought here when this cemetery was opened. Gano is said to have baptized General Washington and to have said the prayer when Washington took leave of his officers in New York. There's the chapel built about 1910, Bruce, at a cost of $7,000. Here's an interesting monument. The story on this, this woman had been married to 3 husbands, and I think had children, all 3 of them. And when they went to bury her, they couldn't figure out how to state it in relation to her all 3 husbands. So they put up this rather nice monument and just put mother on it. That covered the case. Now, since they have added her name, and she was a native of Wakefield, England. Now, there's a close-up of the Sappho Monument. Mayor, you got any idea of what the significance of that is?
Looks like the Green Mill Service, Green Mill. Doesn't Mayor?
Yeah.
Looks like the Green Mill.
It almost looks like a tripod for a tent.
This is an interesting monument. This is for Lindsay, who was active in Frankfort and who wrote articles for the papers under the pseudonym of Blackjack. When I first saw this, I thought that was an old Maytag washer they had on there. You see the pulley where the... But I decided that it wasn't that, and I found out, you see on the top there, there's looks like a broken pitcher or bottle or something. And I believe this has some religious significance, although I can't tell you right now just what it is. That's under a tree, and it's difficult to get a picture of it. There's the Celtic cross in Frankfort Cemetery, and that's the Alexanders, the people out at Airdrie where the governor lives now. That's Lewis Cox. Many of you probably knew him. One of the... Oh, Clifford Smith. Well, yeah, I'm sorry, I was thinking. Clifford and Lewis Cox were associated a lot, but that's Clifford Smith, one of a newer modern type monuments, but rather tasteful, I think.
Did he marry Frances Williams?
There's Lewis Cox. Reminds you of Dorothea Dick.
There's nothing on the other side of the stone?
I don't know. That's Harry Lee Waterfield, one of the newer ones. And there's one interesting to see the 2 hearts, wife and husband. You see a few of those around. And that's Miss Jenny Morton, some of you may remember, who was one of the kingpins of the Kentucky Historical Society and was editor for many years of the Register of the Society. There's Bibb, the man who developed Bibb lettuce. And there's the Tribune vault. Think back to the one we saw in St. Albert. And this has suffered sadly from weather and time and so forth. There's pieces of it laid on the ground. That's the Catholic section. Mayor, who's the one buried there in the front with the cross?
Thomas S. Major, and he was in the Confederate. They were Morgan, and he was a Protestant, but he got sick. Went to the hospital in Cincinnati, and some of the nuns there nursed him back converted him, the father for him, and he later became a priest here at Videographer from 1895 to 1911. And he baptized me in December 1910.
Good, good. I believe you told me that the Catholic cemetery originally was separate ownership, separate operation, but there was.
Right, up
Take-
until about 37 when we had the big flood.
Mm.
A lot of the old records were destroyed. It's hard to say. At that time, Father Dwyer decided to turn it back to the cemetery.
And here's the baby section. I don't know how common that is to have a baby section. Presumably it's for people where they don't have a lot in the cemetery but have a baby to die, and so they're all put in this section.
Beautiful at Christmas time, which are all decorated.
They decorate them and put plastic toys and things and pictures on them. That is general. Well, I'm sorry, my memory's failing me. But anyway, it says that he was a general in the Confederate Army. I did some research, and I can't find any general by that name. There was a colonel who was active in Arkansas during the war, and it may be that he was one of those who was promoted after the war was over. But he had kinfolks in Frankfort, or in Kentucky, and that's why he happened to be buried here. He wasn't a native Kentucky.
Great favor.
Yes. And you notice the inscription there, she hath done what she could. Now, when we got through with the cemetery project, Ramona said that she wanted to put on hers, she did her damnedest. And this is the Confederate section. And most of the people buried there died in Frankfort of disease during the war. Not very many of them died in battle, but they're buried there, and that monument represents all of them. Yes, there was a pond down there, and it disappeared one night, according to Bob Smith. I don't know what happened to it.
You didn't cause it, did you?
What?
You didn't cause it, did you?
No, I didn't do it.
Fell in the river.
I wanted to give you some of the inscription from that monument and compare it with what was in Mount Auburn. I read you what was on the Union Victory Monument. Of course, you didn't see any Confederate monument in Mount Auburn, and you don't see any Union monuments, so far as I know, in Frankfort. But you remember on the monument in Mount Auburn, it said, American Union preserved, African slavery destroyed, by uprising of a great people, by the blood of fallen heroes. Now, Frankfort's Confederate monument, among other things, there's several things around To every man upon the earth death cometh soon or late, and how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temple of his gods? So I think that's significant in denoting the difference between Kentucky and Mount Auburn as far as the Civil War was concerned. Of course, there were more people in Kentucky who were Union than Confederate, but that's what we have down there. Now, I have tried to show you how the rural cemetery movement, which began with Mount Auburn, was seconded by Frankfort and spread throughout the country. Now there are thousands of similar cemeteries which caught this spirit in varying degrees, many in Kentucky and all over the country. It was Edward Everett at Gettysburg who for 2 hours explained how through history people have tried in various ways to make burial places of the dead a lesson for the living. Cecil, you want to turn on the light over there? And Lincoln, in his 272 words, best summed up its highest application when he said, "It is rather for us the living to be here dedicated to the task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that the dead shall not have died in vain." No one can match Lincoln's inspired words, probably the noblest ever spoken in the English language. And we do not have here the scale of death in fighting for a cherished cause that is represented in Gettysburg. However, we do have in our midst the people who made this community, and to a large extent the state, what it is. The thousands of humble citizens, remembered probably only by their neighbors and friends and relatives, and the politicians and the soldiers and the teachers and the doctors and the editors who made us what we are. We here today are what they made of us by their lives. Should we not then study their lives, learn from their mistakes, build on their accomplishments, try to realize the dreams they had in their times, and make Frankfort Cemetery a valuable lesson for the living? Now, things are going on now along that line. Sunday afternoon, there will be several citizens at the graves of some prominent people who are buried there, some of them in period costume, explaining the lives of the people that are represented by those monuments. That's one good thing. Another thing I have been hoping could be done, to issue a booklet of pictures of some of the monuments and brief stories about some of these people that I have talked about, and have that available for people in Frankfort who want to see it, have it available at the cemetery for visitors, so they can get really a little more out of it than just going up and seeing Daniel Boone and going, because there's much more there than Daniel Boone. And I'm hoping that we can find some way to produce that sort of thing. I would appreciate that any of you have any ideas, know how to get it done. I think that would be a good way to make Frankfort Cemetery a lesson for the living, which is what Edward Everett and Bigelow and Lincoln thought it should be. That's it, Larry.
All right, thank you.
that would be a pleasure for the living, and then, of course, as you've said 2 or 3 times at Gettysburg, an instruction for those of us among the living. We're very blessed in having the cemetery here. My sister-in-law, some years ago when she was in college, wrote a poem about visiting the Frankfort Cemetery and referred to it as the park where Boone lay, and it was actually criticized by her teacher for referring to the cemetery as a park. But I think we're very blessed here in having a cemetery that was part of that wonderful rural cemetery movement, and it is truly a park and a place of beauty and a place of instruction as well as remembrance. And thank you very much again, Landon, for sharing this with us tonight. One last pitch for historic Frankfort. I think most of you here are members, but I will remind those of you who are members that we do appreciate your support for these kinds of activities, both by coming out and also your financial support. We do have very nominal dues of $10 for individuals, $15 for families. Any of you who are not members and have enjoyed this tonight and would like to help us support this kind of activity of bringing our very rich local history to the public, we certainly welcome your involvement with that.